Jack Monroe was halfway through his morning coffee when he nearly dropped the mug in shock. A crisp, official-looking letter had arrived in his mailbox just minutes earlier, and although he had expected the usual bills or maybe some tax notices, this was different. Far worse. The bold lettering at the top came from a homeowners association, one he had never joined or even heard of, and it stated that his entire 50-acre ranch was now considered community land for the neighborhood. According to the letter, effective immediately, all barriers, fences, and private property signage on his ranch had to be removed, in accordance with newly extended HOA guidelines. He squinted at the page, reread it, and laughed out loud. But the laughter died in his throat as soon as he reached the part clarifying that the HOA had formally annexed his land, and any refusal to comply would result in fines or possible legal action. Jack's coffee mug slipped from his grip and shattered on the floor, sending shards across his boots. A slow anger built in his chest. These people were serious. It appeared they had decided, entirely without his permission, that his land was now theirs. The same land his grandfather had poured his life into, the same soil that Jack himself had sweated over to maintain and cultivate. He refused to let anyone steal it. An hour later, he stood at the ranch gate, arms folded tightly, waiting. A tan sedan with a large HOA logo painted on the door rolled along his driveway. The car door opened, and out stepped Margaret Dawson, a middle-aged woman in a blazer that looked 3 sizes too snug. She clutched a clipboard and wore an expression of complete authority. Behind her, 2 other board members shuffled about with similarly self-important airs. They fixed their gazes on Jack as if they could bully him into submission. Margaret approached Jack with a practiced, syrupy politeness. She greeted him by name, explained she had sent him the notice regarding the community land designation, and wanted to discuss the next steps. Jack simply eyed her, letting the silence linger until her polite smile began to crack. Next steps, he eventually repeated. Right away, he wanted to make sure she understood he wasn't backing down. When Margaret explained that the HOA had voted unanimously to include his land in their jurisdiction due to its historic access for community members, Jack nearly laughed in her face. He had grown up on this ranch. He knew better than anyone that historic use meant it had been a working ranch, never a public park. He told her as much, but she simply gave a condescending smile and replied that it was community land now. He stared at her, certain this was some outlandish prank. Then a silver SUV appeared behind her, turning onto his driveway. A family of 4 hopped out with their golden retriever and strolled toward his pasture as if it were a municipal park. Jack strode after them, demanding to know who they were and what they thought they were doing. The father shrugged, explaining that Margaret said the HOA opened the ranch for public use, and they'd come to explore. Meanwhile, Margaret trailed close behind, wearing a triumphant look, telling Jack that this was precisely how the community would enjoy their new space. Jack asked them to leave, and they balked, especially the father, accusing Jack of rudeness. Then more cars arrived, some with picnic baskets, some with blankets. The entire ordeal felt like a nightmare. Jack's ranch was becoming an impromptu park in real time. Furious, he demanded Margaret remove everyone at once, but she feigned innocence, saying there was no need for hostility, and that Jack should accept the situation for a smooth transition. Jack had to ball his hands into fists just to keep from yelling outright. He threatened to chase them off his property with a garden hose if she and her guests refused to leave, and Margaret's smug confidence faltered for a moment. She then snapped that the HOA would escalate the matter, spun on her heel, and left. The picnickers, realizing something was off, slowly backed off. One after another, they retreated to their cars and departed, leaving Jack with a knot of rage in his gut. Jack's next call was to his lawyer, Curtis McGraw. Curtis specialized in cases exactly like this, where an overreaching HOA tried to strong-arm people out of their property rights. Within 20 minutes, Jack was sitting in Curtis's office, describing the fiasco from start to finish. Curtis listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes. In a calm voice, he explained that HOAs regularly attempted these power grabs, banking on landowners caving in to avoid long legal battles. But if Jack's property had never been formally annexed or included in any covenant, the HOA had zero legal standing to claim it. Jack frowned, wanting to know precisely how to fight back. He wasn't content to just send them a stern letter, he wanted them to learn never to try such nonsense again. Curtis smirked and said, "You fight dirty." First, Curtis suggested that Jack upgrade his fences, post signage, and make the land downright inhospitable to trespassers. Then they would check the county records for any shred of legality Margaret might cling to. If she found the barest excuse, like an old developer's covenant, she'd exploit it. So they needed to confirm the land had always been free of any binding restrictions. That same day, Jack visited the county records office. He pored over old documents, verifying that his grandfather purchased the land decades ago, with zero mention of an HOA. Satisfied, Jack walked out holding copies of the relevant deeds. At that point, he had the proof in hand that Margaret's annexation was bogus. He decided to let her know personally. Marching into the HOA's cramped little office, he confronted Margaret. She was at a desk with a stack of papers. He dropped a folder in front of her, claiming it was a bill. She quirked an eyebrow, opened the folder, and found official records confirming Jack's land was never part of any association, plus a neatly typed invoice for nearly 2 decades worth of back HOA dues. If they truly believed his ranch was in their territory all these years, they owed him a staggering sum. Margaret went pale. Jack informed her that if she wanted to keep up this charade, she would pay him or face a judge who would see through their fraudulent land grab. Margaret could only stammer that the board wouldn't go along with it, to which Jack responded that she should find a way. Before she could protest further, he walked out. By the time he returned to his ranch, he had arranged for immediate delivery of fencing material, security cameras, motion sensors, and everything else to fortify his boundaries. Trucks arrived with supplies, and workers began installing high-tensile wires along the perimeter. He put in cameras, floodlights, and motion detectors that would flash bright if anyone trespassed after dark. The crowning touch was electrifying the fence. It wouldn't kill anyone, but it would deliver a painful enough shock to discourage an uninvited approach. As dusk fell, Jack posted big signs reading, "Private property, trespassers will be zapped." Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Jack Monroe wasn't messing around. Margaret showed up with 2 board members in tow, fuming at the sight of the electric wires. She claimed it was against HOA regulations. Jack calmly reminded her that he had never signed up for her HOA, so their regulations didn't apply. She sputtered that it was dangerous to put up an electrified fence, but Jack retorted that her trespassers had no reason to touch it if they respected property lines. She warned that she would file a cease and desist. Jack shrugged, unconcerned. In the meantime, the HOA was in utter disarray. People demanded to know why their fees were skyrocketing, courtesy of the fiasco with Jack's ranch. The rest of the board, lacking leadership, begged Jack to step in. They said if he became the new HOA president, he could rewrite the covenants or even dissolve the association. Jack was tempted, but only if it meant an end to the nonsense. He told them, "Fine, but only if I can blow the whole thing up." They put him in charge, and at the next formal meeting, he proposed a motion to disband the HOA entirely. The homeowners, exhausted by Margaret's tyranny, voted overwhelmingly in favor. And so, the homeowners association that tried to steal Jack Monroe's land vanished with a single unanimous vote. No more monthly fees, no more official notices telling people how to mow their lawns. The property owners were finally free from petty tyranny. Margaret, humiliated, packed up and left the neighborhood, refusing to face people who blamed her for nearly bankrupting them. To celebrate, Jack threw a giant barbecue on his ranch. This time, the guests arrived with explicit invitations. Music played, brisket smoked on the grill, and neighbors enjoyed themselves without the weight of HOA rules. Jack stood by the smoker, chatting with Curtis, who joked that Jack had accomplished what many dream of, single-handedly annihilating an HOA. Jack smirked and said, "I told you, I'd fight dirty." They clinked beer bottles in a quiet toast. Later, Jack wandered to the edge of his property. The newly reinforced fences stood tall, still humming with electricity. The big signs were there as well, warding off any future trespassers. When the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack stared at the silhouette of his land. No more threats from a bogus association, no more neighbors wandering uninvited across his fields. This soil was his, the same as it had been for generations. A sense of deep contentment swelled in his chest. The next day, the last official traces of the HOA were wiped from county records. Jack filed all the proper paperwork, ensuring no future claim could be made on his ranch. The neighbors, freed from the burdens of fines and fees, mostly thanked him. Many expressed relief. Some still found the electrified fence extreme, but they understood he had no choice against such blatant intrusion. For Jack, the memory of reading that letter still gave him a chill. He could recall that precise moment when he realized these strangers believed they could simply vote his land away. Looking back at the battle he fought, he felt proud. He had refused to roll over, found a lawyer who knew how to handle overreaching associations, and used every advantage to secure his rights. If Margaret and her cronies had shown any respect from the start, none of this would have happened. But they overplayed their hand, and Jack's steel spine refused to bend. He kept the security system intact. He liked the idea that no group of overconfident board members could do this again, and it gave him peace of mind at night. The ranch was quiet except for the soft hum of the electric lines and the occasional glint of motion sensor lights flicking on. He still welcomed people he liked, but on his terms. That's how it should be, he often thought. A man's land is his own domain to share or not, as he sees fit. Once a month or so, local gossip would mention Margaret. Some said she relocated to a new development, trying to build a fresh reputation. Others claimed she was facing lawsuits from people who blamed her for the fiasco. Jack had no interest in the details. He was content to enjoy his ranch unbothered. He tended to his livestock, repaired his barn, and occasionally sipped coffee on his porch, remembering the day the HOA letter arrived. Never again would he let anyone trample his boundaries with a pen and a vote. Neighbors occasionally teased him about being the rancher who destroyed the HOA. He took it in stride, acknowledging that it was partly luck, partly the right timing, and partly the unwavering stance he adopted. He learned that if you gave an inch, people like Margaret would take a mile, so he gave them nothing. People in town who once glowed about community associations now talked about the hazards of giving too much power to a few controlling individuals. The cautionary tale spread to other neighborhoods, discouraging them from pushing land grabs. In the end, the ranch survived, and so did Jack's sense of ownership. He had proven that no matter how official a letter looked, or how bold an HOA was, a property owner with the will to fight could stand his ground. The fences remained electrified as a reminder that while neighbors might be welcome for friendly gatherings, no one got to claim an inch of it without Jack's express say-so. And so, Jack Monroe continued to live on his land, unburdened by nonsense rules and free from meddling neighbors. The old coffee mug that shattered that day had been replaced, and every time he drank from the new one, he remembered how a letter nearly threatened to upend his family's legacy. The day ended with him sipping his coffee on the porch, staring across the fields at dusk, an electric fence humming quietly in the background. And, for once, the knowledge that no one was coming to take what rightfully belonged to him was enough to ease him into a peaceful sleep each night.